Before we start, I'd like to give a massive shout out to the following people for supporting Stories Telling Stories on Patreon: Jim Ross, Holly, Tamara, Tom, Maddy, and Carrie. Thank you so much for your support. If you'd like to help support the show and hear your name listed before future episodes, head on over to patreon.com/storiestellingstories. This week on Locked into Vacancy, we're celebrating a milestone, having hit 25,000 downloads for the Stories Telling Stories podcast. It may seem like an unusual metric to celebrate, as most social media looks for nice, round numbers to mark as milestones. But 25 is my lucky number, and we're going to make it count. In celebration of the occasion, I've got a special guest joining us on this episode. She's an actor, television presenter, content creator, dog mom, and professional YouTuber with over 140,000 subscribers and counting. Her content runs the gamut from the weird to the wonderful, and I've had the absolute pleasure of getting to know her over the last few years. From Dublin, Ireland, please welcome certified lovely human, Diane Jennings.
Hello, Eric. How are you?
Good. Happy to have you here.
Happy to be here.
Yay! One thing I've been particularly interested about is your process when it goes into writing your episodes. Let's use, for example, you're doing a top 10. Do you tend to look for things that you can pull a lot from memory, or do you get the idea and then have to sit down and do the research to back it up?
Usually I'll come up with a title, and then from there I'll start thinking, okay, say, I don't know, it's top 10 coolest places in Philadelphia or something. And then I'll be like, okay, well, can I think of like 10 cool places in Philadelphia, and does that make me laugh? And so yeah, it just kind of comes from my brain here. And so yeah, I try and think of not the regular stuff, because I'm like, I hate when I tune in for something and I'm like, oh, I know all this stuff. Go to Disneyland, I know. Like, you know. So yeah, that's kind of how I do it, if that makes any sense.
And then expanding upon that, it's all very well spoken, and I'm curious how much of what you present is pre-written, like not necessarily saying you're reading a script, but how much of that do you think you've pre-prepared and how much are you scripting?
That's cool. No, I take that as a massive compliment. It's not really scripted much at all. So usually I'll just like say it's a top 10, which is kind of like the basic kind of video that I have on the channel. I'll come up with like number 10, and then I'll just put a bullet point, and then maybe below that I'll put a couple of sub bullet points. But scripting wise, it's not at all. But I'm told as a person I'm quite eloquent, or some of my friends say, oh, you use the big words. So maybe that's why it kind of comes across a bit scripted. So I take that as the highest form of compliment. Thank you very much.
Well, you're very welcome. Must pull heavily from improv in that regard. So
sure. Well, I mean, as I'm talking, usually I'll say something, like I'll just ramble away to myself, because usually I'll shoot for like an hour and a half. It'll be like a 10-minute video, and then if I like something I'm saying, but I say it wrong and I flub it, I'll re-say it, and that's where the bloopers come from.
Okay, and that's sort of what led me to think that, you know, some of this may be scripted, just in the bloopers, repeating the same phrase and the same phrase. But
no, it's kind of like, I'll just be like, oh, I like how I'm saying that, and then I'll be like, but I'm saying it wrong, or yeah, it'll just kind of go over it and over and over to the point that I drive myself insane, which is where the editor comes in.
Absolutely. We both come from a performing background, and I'm curious how much of performing, acting, improv element you think goes through into your content, and how much of it is just genuinely you.
I kind of say to people casually, jokingly, like, oh, it's a character, but at the same time it isn't. It's sort of like, I would equate it to, if you are a waitress working in a restaurant, you present, you know, you wouldn't say, oh, it's a character going to the tables, but you're there in a kind of professional capacity, and you're donning your waitress character, you know what I mean?
Yep.
So in that sense, it's a character, but it's me. So kind of like how some days I'll come in and I'll say, oh, I'm a bit muddledy today or whatever. If I'm having a bad day, I won't necessarily say it. So in that sense, you kind of might say, it's a character, but in the same sense that if you were presenting a TV show, you wouldn't come on a TV show and go, "Hi, I've had a really bad day," you know.
Yeah.
So it is. I don't know if character is the right word. I think it's just a good way of communicating to a mainstream audience an understanding of like you're not like that all the time. Like I'm not, you know, bubbly and full of beans all the time when I'm doing a video. You know what I mean? But at the same time, I am like that a lot of the time. So yeah.
Yeah, and you brought up a good point there about the importance of, as part of that persona, really checking your drama at the door, leaving your drama at the door. That was...
And I like your use of the word persona. Like, I think that's probably more accurate than what I have been saying, which is character, because it's not a character. It's not like a made-up person. Persona is good. Good job, Eric.
Thank you.
Good wording.
But diving further into that acting element, let's, for fun, go back and talk about the first thing that you ever acted in. I'm curious.
Well, I guess the nativity play in school. I was innkeeper's wife number 2. And to this day, I cannot recall if the innkeeper had 2 wives or if I was the second innkeeper's wife. But I think I was so insulted by not being Mary that I made a bid to determine there and then that I was no longer going to be innkeeper's wife number 2, and I got upgraded to angel the next year.
Ooh.
So that was great. And then I was Joseph. I never did get to be Mary. You know, close enough.
Makes it sound like your character died. I was the innkeeper's wife, and then I was an angel next year. They killed me off.
Well, I always thought it was the teacher's pet got to play Mary, and I was never the teacher's pet. So, you know, Joseph was more fun. It was a better character to play. You know, I got to channel my inner masculinity.
Did you get to wear a beard and everything?
Yeah, I got to wheel Mary around. I must find that footage. Actually, it's good fun. My robe got caught in the donkey's wheel, and yeah, everybody laughed at me, but I laughed too, and I felt like that was formative.
So, do you think it was acting in those shows that sort of put that acting bug, that performance bug into you, that made you want to pursue it?
Yeah, you know what? It was funny. My mom, I said it to her since that I said it was such a profound thing that stuck with me, and she says it must have been just a throwaway remark that she made. But I remember my mom saying to me, when you're on the stage now, don't wave, because a lot of the kids will wave, but you're in character. And I remember thinking, yeah, I'm the character. The character wouldn't wave. So I don't know, I guess that stuck with me. And then I think they all praised me a lot afterwards, to the point that now, like when my niece is in shows, I'm like, it's a terrible profession to be in. I'm like, don't tell her she was too great, because we don't want her to go into acting, you know? So, yeah, it was those little shows, though, that kind of made it for you, I guess. How about you?
I'm 3 years into college, and my roommate wants to audition for a show, but he's too nervous to do it by himself, and he wants me to go audition with him. And I'm like, I'm not an actor. That's like, as I was in school, I was going to be a writer. And I was like, okay, whatever. It was for a show called Cannibal the Musical, which was written by Trey Parker of South Park fame. It was actually his, when he was in film school, that was his project, was he wrote and filmed a musical. And it's about these cannibals in Colorado, like, who are gold miners, and it's hilarious. I mean, everyone dies and eats each other, but it's a good time. And so I auditioned for that show just because he wanted some moral support, and I ended up getting cast as the villain. And so I was like, okay, I guess I'm doing this now. And we put the show on, and it was generally received as the worst show to have ever been put on at the college.
Oh no, that's not where I thought this was going.
That being said, it got me interested enough in musical theater, of all things, that the following spring I auditioned for the departmental production of Cabaret, and I got like some ensemble part. But that experience sort of clinched it for me, and I ended up changing all my majors. And like 3 years into college, I'm like, okay, we're doing this differently. So I doubled back down, jumped into all theater classes, doing every show I could possibly do, including community theater stuff. I think there was a 3-year stretch where I wasn't doing a show or that I was actively working in one. And it all started from that from that crappy Cannibal musical. And I got my degree in musical theater, and I got a secondary bachelor's in playwriting and directing on top of that. So my 9 years in college sort of balanced out to 2 bachelor's degrees. So kind of worked.
Amazing. I think it's really good to have both, though, behind the scenes and on stage or on camera, whatever it is. I think to have a true appreciation, it helps to have experience and understanding of both. It's amazing how everything kind of ties in together, isn't it?
Yeah. And now here I am recycling my my upbringing of literature and writing with performing, and now I'm got my little podcast going, which has really been a lifesaver with 2020 and everything being canceled and shut down, and trying not to name specific things that caused it. But the story we got today is a short story by Roald Dahl, who I'm sure all of us at some point in our childhood or our adolescence took an affinity to in one way or another, either through something as casual as watching Charlie and the Chocolate Factory or reading his books and just finding our own personal connection with them.
I read this when I was a kid. Me and my dad used to read the Roald Dahl short stories. And yeah, I don't know, I guess maybe in the context of my remembering it among all those other stories, but maybe when I look at it separately, yeah, it doesn't necessarily have some of the hallmarks of a typical Roald Dahl story. I can see that.
So we're going to do a dramatic reading for you here, and I hope you enjoy it. So this is The Landlady by Roald Dahl. Billy Weaver had travelled down from London on the slow afternoon train, with a change at Swindon on the way, and by the time he got to Bath, it was about 9 o'clock in the evening, and the moon was coming up out of a clear starry sky over the houses opposite the station entrance. But the air was deadly cold, and the wind was like a flat blade of ice on his cheeks. "Excuse me," he said, "is there a fairly cheap hotel not too far away from here?"
Try the Bell and Dragon,
the porter answered, pointing down the road.
They might take you in. It's about a quarter of a mile long, on the other side.
Billy thanked him and picked up his suitcase and set out to walk the quarter mile to the Bell and Dragon. He had never been to Bath before. He didn't know anyone who lived there, but Mr. Greenslade at the head office in London had told him that it was a splendid city.
Find your own lodgings,
he had said,
and then go along and report to the branch manager as soon as you've got yourself settled.
Billy was 17 years old. He was wearing a new navy blue overcoat, a new brown trilby hat, and a new brown suit, and he was feeling fine. He walked briskly down the street. He was trying to do everything briskly these days. Briskness, he had decided, was the one common characteristic of all successful businessmen. The big shots at the head office were absolutely fantastically brisk all the time. They were amazing. There were no shops on this wide street that he was walking along, only a line of tall houses on either side, all of them identical. They had porches and pillars and 4 or 5 steps going up to their front doors, and it was obvious that once upon a time they had been very swanky residences. But now, even in the darkness, he could see that the paint was peeling from the woodwork on their doors and windows, and that the handsome white facades were cracked and blotchy from neglect. Suddenly, in a downstairs window that was brilliantly illuminated by a street lamp not 6 yards away, Billy caught sight of a printed notice propped up against the glass in one of the upper panes. It said, "Bed and Breakfast." There was a vase of yellow chrysanthemums, tall and beautiful, standing just underneath the notice. He stopped walking. He moved a bit closer. Green curtains, of sort of velvet material, were hanging down on either side of the window. The chrysanthemums looked wonderful beside them. He went right up and peered through the glass into the room, and the first thing he saw was a bright fire burning in the hearth. On the carpet in front of the fire, a pretty little dachshund was curled up asleep with its nose tucked into its belly. The room itself, so far as he could see in the half-darkness, was filled with pleasant furniture. There was a baby grand piano and a big sofa and several plump armchairs, and in one corner he spotted a large parrot in a cage. Animals were usually a good sign in a place like this, Billy told himself. And all in all, it looked to him as though it would be a pretty decent house to stay in. Certainly it would be more comfortable than the Bell and Dragon. On the other hand, a pub would be more congenial than a boarding house. There would be beer and darts in the evening, and lots of people to talk to, and it would probably be a good bit cheaper, too. He had stayed a couple of nights in a pub once before, and he had liked it. He had never stayed in any boarding houses, and, to be perfectly honest, he was a tiny bit frightened of them. The name itself conjured up images of watery cabbage, rapacious landladies, and a powerful smell of kippers in the living room. After dithering about like this in the cold for 2 or 3 minutes, Billy decided that he would walk on and take a look at the Bell and Dragon before making up his mind. He turned to go, and now a queer thing happened to him. He was in the act of stepping back and turning away from the window when all of a sudden his eye was caught and held in the most peculiar manner by the small notice that was there. Bed and breakfast. It said, bed and breakfast. Bed and breakfast. Bed and breakfast. Each word was like a large black eye staring at him through the glass, holding him, compelling him, forcing him to stay where he was and not to walk away from that house. And the next thing he knew, he was actually moving across from the window to the front door of the house, climbing the steps that led up to it, and reaching for the bell. He pressed the bell. Far away in a back room, he heard it ringing, and then at once, it must have been at once because he hadn't had time to take his finger from the bell button, the door swung open, and a woman was standing there. Normally, you ring the bell and you have at least a half-minute's wait before the door opens. But this dame was like a jack-in-the-box. He pressed the bell, and out she popped. It made him jump. She was about 45 or 50 years old, and the moment she saw him, she gave him a warm, welcoming smile.
"Please, come in,"
she said pleasantly. She stepped aside, holding the door wide open, and Billy found himself automatically starting forward into the house. The compulsion, or more accurately, the desire to follow after her into that house was extraordinarily strong. "I saw the notice in the window," he said, holding himself back.
"Yes, I know.
"I was wondering about a room,"
It's all ready for you, my dear,"
she said. She had a round pink face and very gentle blue eyes. "I was on my way to the Bell and Dragon," Billy told her, "but the notice in your window just happened to catch my eye."
"My dear boy,"
she said.
"why don't you come in out of the cold?
"How much do you charge?"
5 and 6pence a night, including breakfast."
It was fantastically cheap. It was less than half of what he had been willing to pay.
"If that is too much,"
she added.
"then perhaps I can reduce it just a tiny bit. Do you desire an egg for breakfast? Eggs are expensive at the moment. It will be 6pence less without an egg."
5 and 6pence is fine, he answered. "I should very much like to stay here."
"I knew you would. Do come in."
She seemed terribly nice. She looked exactly like the mother of one's best school friend, welcoming one into the house to stay for the Christmas holiday. Billy took off his hat and stepped over the threshold.
"Just hang it there,
She said.
and let me help you with your coat."
There were no other hats and coats in the hall. There were no umbrellas, no walking sticks, nothing.
"We have it all to ourselves.
She said, smiling at him over her shoulder as she led the way upstairs.
You see, it isn't very often I have the pleasure of taking a visitor into my little nest."
The old girl is slightly dotty, Billy told himself, but at 5 and 6pence a night, who gives a damn about that? "I thought you'd be simply swamped with applicants," he said politely.
"Oh, I am, my dear, I am. Of course I am. But the trouble is that I'm inclined to be just a teeny-weeny bit choosy in particular, if you see what I mean."
Ah, yes.
"But I'm always ready. Everything is always ready, day and night in this house, just on the off chance that an acceptable young gentleman will come along. And it is such a pleasure, my dear, such a very great pleasure when now and again I open the door and I see someone standing there who is just exactly right.
She was halfway up the stairs, and she paused with one hand on the stair rail, turning her head and smiling down at him with pale lips.
Like you.
She added, and her blue eyes traveled slowly all the way down the length of Billy's body, to his feet, and then up again. On the first-floor landing, she said to him,
This floor is mine.
They climbed up a second flight.
And this one is all yours.
She said.
Here's your room. I do hope you'll like it.
She took him into a small but charming front bedroom, switching on the light as she went in.
The morning sun comes right in the window, Mr. Perkins. It is Mr. Perkins, isn't it?
No, he said. It's Weaver.
Mr. Weaver, how nice. I've put a water bottle between the sheets to air them out, Mr. Weaver. It's such a comfort to have a hot water bottle in a strange bed with clean sheets, don't you agree? And you may light the gas fire at any time if you feel chilly.
Thank you, Billy said. Thank you ever so much. He noticed that the bedspread had been taken off the bed, and that the bedclothes had been neatly tucked back on one side, all ready for someone to get in.
I'm so glad you appeared. I was beginning to get worried.
That's all right, Billy answered brightly. You mustn't worry about me. He put his suitcase on the chair and started to open it.
And what about supper, my dear? Did you manage to get anything to eat before you came here?
I'm not a bit hungry, thank you, he said. I think I'll just go to bed as soon as possible, because tomorrow I've got to get up rather early and report to the office.
Very well, then. I'll leave you now so that you can unpack, but before you go to bed, would you be kind enough to pop into me in the sitting room on the ground floor and sign the book? Everyone has to do that because it's the law of the land and we don't want to go breaking any laws at this stage in the proceedings, do we?
She gave him a little wave of the hand and went quickly out of the room and closed the door. Now, the fact that this landlady appeared to be slightly off her rocker didn't worry Billy in the least. After all, she was not only harmless, there was no question about that, but she was also quite obviously a kind and generous soul. He guessed that she had probably lost a son in the war, or something like that, and had never gotten over it. So a few minutes later, after unpacking his suitcase and washing his hands, he trotted downstairs to the ground floor and entered the living room. His landlady wasn't there, but the fire was glowing in the hearth, and the little dachshund was still sleeping in front of it. The room was wonderfully warm and cozy. I'm a lucky fellow, he thought, rubbing his hands. This is a bit of all right. He found the guest book lying open on the piano, so he took out his pen and wrote down his name and address. There were only 2 other entries above his on the page, and, as one always does with guest books, he started to read them. One was Christopher Mulholland from Cardiff. The other was Gregory W. Temple from Bristol. It's funny, he thought suddenly. Christopher Mulholland. It rings a bell. Now, where on earth had he heard that rather unusual name before? Was he a boy at school? No. Was it one of his sister's numerous young men? Perhaps. Or a friend of his father's? No, it wasn't any of those. He glanced down again at the book. Christopher Mulholland, 231 Cathedral Road, Cardiff. Gregory W. Temple, 27 Sycamore Drive, Bristol. As a matter of fact, now he came to think of it, he wasn't at all sure that the second name didn't have almost as much of a familiar ring about it as the first. Gregory Temple, he said aloud, searching his memory. Christopher Mulholland.
Such charming boys.
A voice behind him answered, and he turned and saw his landlady sailing into the room with a large silver tea tray in her hands. She was holding it well out in front of her and rather high up, as though the tray were a pair of reins on a frisky horse. They sound somehow familiar, he said.
They do. How interesting.
I'm almost positive I've heard those names somewhere before. Isn't that queer? Maybe it was in the newspapers. They weren't famous in any way, were they? I mean, famous cricketers, footballers, something like that.
Famous?
She said, setting the tea tray down on the low table in front of the sofa.
Oh, no, I don't think they were famous. But they were extraordinarily handsome. both of them. I can promise you that. They were tall and young and handsome, my dear, just exactly like you.
Once more, Billy glanced down at the book. "Look here," he said, noting the dates. "This last entry's over 2 years old."
It is.
Yes, indeed. And Christopher Mulholland is nearly a year before that. More than 3 years ago.
Dear me.
She said, shaking her head and heaving a dainty little sigh.
I would never have thought it. How does time fly away from us all, doesn't it, Mr. Wilkins?
It's Weaver, Billy said. Weaver.
Oh, of course it is.
She cried, sitting down on the sofa.
How silly of me. I do apologize. In one ear and out the other. That's me, Mr. Weaver.
You know something? Billy said. Something that's really quite extraordinary about all this?
No, dear, I don't.
Well, you see, both of these names, Mulholland and Temple, I not only seem to remember each one of them separately, so to speak, but somehow or other, in some peculiar way, they both appear to be sort of connected together as well, as though they were both famous for the same sort of thing. If you see what I mean, like Dempsey and Tunney, for example, or Churchill and Roosevelt.
Amusing.
She said.
But come over here now, dear, and sit beside me on the sofa, and I'll give you a nice cup of tea and a ginger biscuit before you go to bed.
You really shouldn't bother, Billy said. I didn't mean you to do anything like that. He stood by the piano, watching her as she fussed about with the cups and saucers. He noticed that she had small, white, quickly moving hands and red fingernails. I'm almost positive it was in the newspaper I saw them, Billy said. I'll think of it in a second, I'm sure I will. There's nothing more tantalizing than a thing like this which lingers just outside the border of one's memory. He hated to give up. Now wait a minute, he said. Wait a minute! Mulholland. Christopher Mulholland. Wasn't that the name of the Eton schoolboy who was on a walking tour through the West Country and then all of a sudden...
Milk?
She said.
And sugar?
Oh, yes, please. And then all of a sudden...
Eton schoolboy?
She said.
Oh, no, my dear, that can't possibly be right, because my Mr. Mulholland was certainly not an Eton schoolboy when he came to me. He was a Cambridge undergraduate. Come over here now and sit next to me and warm yourself in front of this lovely fire. Come on, your tea's all ready for you.
She patted the empty place beside her on the sofa, and she sat there smiling at Billy and waiting for him to come over. He crossed the room slowly and sat down on the edge of the sofa. She placed his teacup on the table in front of him.
There we are,
she said.
How nice and cozy this is, isn't it?
Billy started sipping his tea. She did the same. For half a minute or so, neither of them spoke. But Billy knew that she was looking at him. Her body was half turned towards him, and he could feel her eyes resting on his face, watching him over the rim of her teacup. Now and again, he caught a whiff of a peculiar smell that seemed to emanate directly from her person. It was not in the least unpleasant, and it reminded him, well, he wasn't quite sure what it reminded him of. Pickled walnuts? New leather? Or was it the corridors of a hospital?
Mr. Mulholland was a great one for his tea,
she said at length.
Never in my life have I seen anyone who drinks as much tea as dear, sweet Mr. Mulholland.
I suppose he left fairly recently, Billy said. He was still quite puzzling his head about the two names. He was positive now that he had seen them in the newspapers, in the headlines.
Left?
She said, arching her brows.
But my dear boy, he never left. He's still here. Mr. Temple is also here. They're on the 3rd floor, both of them, together.
Billy set down his cup slowly on the table and stared at his landlady. She smiled back at him. And then she put out one of her white hands and patted him comfortingly on the knee.
How old are you, my dear?
17.
17!
She cried.
Oh, it's the perfect age. Mr. Mulholland was also 17, but I think he was a trifle shorter than you are. In fact, I'm sure he was, and his teeth weren't quite so white. You have the most beautiful teeth, Mr. Weaver. Do you know that?
They're not as good as they look, Billy said. They've got simply masses of fillings in them at the back.
Mr. Temple, of course, was a little older,
she said, ignoring his remark.
He was actually 28, and yet I never would have guessed it. He hadn't told me. Never in my whole life there wasn't a blemish on his body.
A what? Billy said.
His skin was just like a baby's.
There was a pause. Billy picked up his teacup and took another sip of his tea, then set it down again gently in its saucer. He waited for her to say something else, but she seemed to have lapsed into another of her silences. He sat there staring straight ahead of him, into the far corner of the room, biting his lower lip. "That parrot," he said at last. "You know something? It had me completely fooled when I first saw it through the window from the street. I could have sworn it was alive."
Alas, no longer.
"That's most terribly clever the way it's been done," he said. "It doesn't look in the least bit dead. Who did it?"
I did.
"You did?"
Of course.
she said.
And have you met my little Basil as well?
She nodded towards the dachshund curled up so comfortably in front of the fire. Billy looked at it, and suddenly he realized that this animal had all the time been just as silent and motionless as the parrot. He put out a hand and touched it gently on the top of its back. The back was hard and cold, and when he pushed the hair to one side with his fingers, he could see the skin underneath, grayish black and dry and perfectly preserved. "Good gracious me," he said. "How absolutely fascinating." He turned away from the dog and stared with deep admiration at the little woman beside him on the sofa. "It must be most awfully difficult to do a thing like that."
Not in the least,
she said.
I stuff all my little pets myself when they pass away. Will you have another cup of tea?
No, thank you, Billy said. The tea tasted faintly of bitter almonds, and he didn't much care for it.
You did sign the book, didn't you?
Oh, yes.
That's good, because later on, if I happen to forget what you were called, then I can always come down here and look it up. I still do that almost every day with Mr. Mulholland and Mr.
Temple, Billy said. Gregory Temple. Excuse my asking, but haven't there been any other guests here except them in the last 2 or 3 years? Holding a teacup high in one hand, inclining her head slightly to the left, she looked up at him out of the corner of her eyes and gave him another gentle little smile.
No, my dear,
she said.
Only you.
The end. Locked in a Vacancy is produced in collaboration with Stories Telling Stories and STS Media Group, collaborating with ample social distancing between Milton, Vermont
and Dublin, Ireland. STS is casting around the globe to your frontal lobe whenever podcasts are found.
Make sure to follow Diane Jennings on YouTube and give her a follow on Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, and TikTok. And let us know if you'd like to see more collaborations down the road.
And until next time, stay sane.
Stay safe.
Stay weird.
And stay whimsical. Ding!
Awesome.
Thank you for joining me. This was a lot of fun.
Thanks for inviting me, and I feel honored. Thanks, Eric.
Thank you, Diane.
Talk to you later. Bye.
Yep, have a good night.